to another visiting speaker seminar in the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship series. I'm Tariq Maudud, the director of the center, and the speaker today is someone familiar to most of us, I think, in one way or another, because he is a colleague in the School of Education. That's Professor Leon Tickley. We have circulated a paper of his that the talk's based on. I hope you've had a chance to look at it. Paper just published a couple of weeks ago in the journal Ethnicities. And to introduce Leon himself, he's offered a very brief kind of bio of himself, but this is it. So Leon is UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Good Quality Education at this university. He's conducted research and published widely on issues of race equality in education in the UK and in South Africa. And I know Leon does other work in Africa as well. And he currently directs a UKRI Network Plus on transforming education for sustainable futures with partners in Africa and India. So welcome, Leon. You have about 45 to 50 minutes presentation. We won't, rush you. Take your time, and then people can come in with questions, comments, any kind of discussion, and we normally wrap up about 6:30. So on that basis, welcome again, Leon, and over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Tariq, for that kind introduction. And it's a great honor to be invited to talk at the center and to see some familiar faces. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces. And of course, I think we're all, preoccupied right at this very instant with events in Ukraine, which are unfolding. But nonetheless, I hope that we'll be able to talk about the Sewell Report, because I think it's a very important report in terms of the current state of race relations in the UK, and I think it's an important milestone in those debates, and I'll elaborate on that. I'm going to share my screen, so I hope that you can all see it. We did do a test run earlier, and it all went well. But Yuhan, can you just confirm that that you can see the screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, so what I'd like to do today, I think, is just to provide a little bit of background to the Sewell Report, and then I'd like to focus a little bit on the education component. As Tariq mentioned, I'm an educationalist, and my background really goes right back to the days of the Inner London Education Authority, if people remember that time. And I've been involved as a practitioner in developing anti-racist and multicultural initiatives in schools. As Tariq mentioned, I also have an interest in Africa, and my background is as the son of a South African refugee and involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I've written about race and ethnicity in South Africa too. I think it's always important to position oneself in these kinds of debates. And as you'll see, I position myself really between what I will describe as a multicultural and an anti-racist discourse. So over the years, I've had the pleasure of lots of interesting conversations with Tariq on these issues. I'd like to then kind of introduce the idea of racial formation as a theoretical framing, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Omi and Winant's ideas about racial formation. So I'll just briefly introduce them because I think they're important for the approach that I've adopted. And then I want to explain how I've really used their ideas to identify 3 racial projects in society and in education a nationalist, a conservative nationalist project, a multicultural and anti-racist project. And I want to argue really that, you know, the Sewell Report is fundamentally flawed, and I'll explain why I think that's the case. I think that it's, but I do think that it's important to understand the report and where it's coming from, to try and situate it within a wider politics of race and ethnicity in the UK. But I'd like to also suggest that actually, you know, it is a bit of a milestone report, and it does prompt us as people committed to multiculturalism, to anti-racism, to stand back and to think about our project and our struggle for racial and cultural justice in education, the wider struggle for racial and cultural justice. So I'll make some suggestions along those lines at the end. Okay, I think, you know, in terms of situating the report, of course, you know, it came out just under a year ago, and the Commission for Racial Disparities, the Sewell Report, otherwise known as the Sewell Report, was commissioned by Johnson's government. And in fact, it was Munira Mirza who was, as we know, has recently resigned from as the head of the Downing Street Policy Unit, was the one who actually put the commission together. And Mirza, like Sewell himself and several other members of the commission, had previously come out and said they didn't believe that institutionalized racism exists. So, you know, that's important, because, you know, if one understands it, as I think one should, as part of a wider hegemonic project of the right, then I think, you know, it's significant that you know, that the people appointed to the commission held these prior commitments and views and had openly stated these in various fora. It's also significant that many members of the commission, including Sewell himself, were from Black and Asian backgrounds. And, you know, one can also kind of see that, one could also argue that perhaps that's also, you know, another example of how the report can be seen as part of a wider hegemonic project of the right. And I think, you know, understanding it in those terms is important. So the report was met, you know, with a mixture of euphoria by the right-wing press, you know, people, journalists writing for The Sun and for the Mail and the Express and so on, you know, really saw it as an important attack on what they call wokedom. It really became, you know, a center point, a focal point for the Tory culture wars that have been generated at the time and subsequently. And, you know, in terms of kind of understanding this, I think it's important to try and situate it within what Gramsci originally described as organic crisis. And the organic crisis of capitalism. And, you know, this idea was taken up by Stuart Hall and his colleagues at the centre, at the Birmingham Centre, way back in the late 70s and early 80s. And it was in that context that Stuart Hall, drawing on this idea of Gramsci's ideas of hegemony and organic crisis, coined the term the new right, which he used to try and explain the rise of Thatcherism in terms of the demonic coupling of a free market libertarianism on the one hand, a neoliberal project, with an authoritarian nationalist agenda. And that demonic coupling was really the basis in Hall's views for Thatcherism. And, you know, I think with extending that analysis a bit and thinking about the present, one could see that actually, you know, what you can see with the current Tory government and Johnson's administration is a resurgence of the old right, a much more traditionalist and populist agenda, And, you know, it's been linked, of course, with a reassertion of Britishness, of British institutions, with the Brexit vote, and with the levelling up agenda. So race has been centrally implicated in this new reimagining of the national popular, if you like, organized around an idea that that actually, you know, we are in a post-racial, in a color, we're not in a racist society anymore, and that actually, you know, what matters is leveling up and playing to trying to attract the votes of the white working class. And of course, Labour has also had fault lines around these kinds of areas in the past as well. So one can see, you know, the Sewell Report in its denial of institutionalized racism, in its central arguments of actually what we need to do is level up and channel our resources at the white working class, as, you know, an extension of this project. And of course, you know, the Tory culture wars have been very much a part of that, you know, the critique of Black Lives Matter, of taking the knee, and all of that kind of thing. So I think it's important to try and situate the Sewell Report against that kind of background. That is to say that it's doing work, it's doing ideological work for this new right-wing populist agenda. I think it's important, although I want to focus on the idea of racial formation and the wider context of the Sewell Report, I want to extend that analysis. I think it's important to try and put it into some kind of context. And I'd like to just provide a very brief overview of the report and why I think it's flawed. So I've written more about this in an article that's just come out in the British Education Research Journal, where I focus more on the methodological aspects of the report. So my critique really, you know, along with that of others, focuses on three main aspects of the report. So first of all, you know, what the report essentially argued was that in education, as in other spheres, we've gone past institutionalized racism, that actually, according to the definition of institutionalized racism as set out in the Macpherson inquiry, institutionalized racism is systematic discrimination against people in institutions on account of their race and ethnicity no longer exists. The report does acknowledge, you know, individual instances of bias and prejudice, but it says that at an institutional level, the idea of institutionalized racism no longer exists, and that in fact, the UK can hold itself up in education as in other spheres as really a shining beacon of what can be achieved in terms of race equality. So it uses, for the main part in the education section, which I'm focusing on, work that was done by a colleague of mine, Steve Strand, who did a secondary analysis of the longitudinal study of young people in England, the LSYPE data set that many sociologists and others have explored in the past. And his findings that are reproduced in the report and are used to kind of confirm the main findings of the report are that in terms of raw data, it's only Black, Caribbean and people of Pakistani heritage who underperform compared to white working class people. That in terms of raw scores in attainment measures, it's other ethnic minorities, including Chinese and Indian learners and so on, perform much better than white learners. Then Steve Strand does a series of regression analyses to show that once one takes into account socioeconomic background, in fact, those differences are eradicated in terms of underachievement. That in fact, in terms of when one controls for social class, according to this analysis, it's only in fact two groups: black boys, middle class boys, and Pakistani girls who do less well than other groups compared to once one takes class into account. Now, you know, in that kind of analysis is at one level, you know, it provides what can be described as a surface actuality, you know, but of what the situation is. But, you know, as Portes and other statisticians have been at pains to point out, the idea that you can control for class in this kind of way is highly problematic, because of course we know that race and class are mutually implicated in reproducing each other. It's very difficult to separate out issues of class from racial formation, so that you know, the experiences of, for example, Black Caribbean people, the continued experience of underachievement in education is linked to their class position in wider society, but also the extent to which labor markets, housing markets, social welfare, health, as we've been hearing about recently in the press, are racialized as well in terms of their outcomes. So it's very difficult to disentangle over generations the effects of class and race. They're mutually implicated. And of course, you know, the sole focus on outcomes at GCSE level ignores the fact that actually when one looks at vocational education and training, or access to higher education, particularly to so-called high tariff institutions, then these racial disparities continue to be evident. Also, it focuses on a very narrow understanding of racial disparities in terms of outcomes at GCSE. It doesn't take into account, for example, the lived experience of racism. In fact, the report explicitly disavows that kind of evidence as being of any validity. So it, you know, following other Tory statements, or statements by other Tory ministers such as Liz Truss, you know, who have explicitly come out and said that lived experience is not a valid way of understanding disparities. The Sewell Report continues in that vein. So it also disavows the importance of qualitative evidence of racism, including racialized bullying and other aspects of racism, such as Islamophobia and so on. And I'll come back to those in a little while. So it's very selective in its use of evidence. It doesn't take into account, you know, the large amount of evidence that was submitted to show that institutional racism does in fact exist. And I'll talk about that evidence in a moment. The second main critique of the report is its erasure of racism. So in the denial of institutional racism, it doesn't take into account a whole host of evidence, or it sidelines, or it delegitimizes, it renders as being less important evidence that has been collected, including by Steve Strand over many years, ironically, you know, that for example, Black Caribbean and white Black Caribbean learners are much more likely to be entered into lower exam tiers, that they're much more likely to be excluded from school, either on a fixed term or a permanent basis. They're much more likely to be given a statement of special educational needs, and so on. And there is a huge amount of evidence, including evidence that I've done myself with colleagues in sociology, national studies of schools looking at the performance, the achievement of Black Caribbean and white Black Caribbean learners, that has really shown, how these processes of racialization take hold in school or operate in schools, how teachers do operate with lower expectations for these groups, and that plays a part in the extent to which they are more likely to be put into lower streams or excluded from school or given SEN statements. So there's a whole host of evidence that has simply been ignored by the report, and a denial of this idea of institutionalized racism, the systematic discrimination or the web of practices that systematically discriminate against some groups. And of course, we've seen that also in relation to Islamophobia. We've seen, with the prevent agenda, for example, that, other people in the room have written about very eloquently, how institutions or how the education system at an institutional level, at a systemic level, discriminates against people from Islamic backgrounds in terms of not recognizing their faith or identities, or actively discriminating against them through various measures such as the prevent agenda. So also, rather than kind of acknowledge the existence of institutionalized racism, the report takes the approach of blaming the victim. And here, this goes back to work that Sewell has been putting forward over many, many years, where his claim is that actually the cause of underachievement is to do with the absence of fathers, Black fathers with broken homes, and with the effects of peer group, anti-academic peer group pressure on young Black males. And of course, these explanations are not new. They've been around for a long time, but they've also been highly contested. Because as many people have said, the situation isn't really as simple as that, that in fact, when one looks at, for example, the role of Black fathers in the upbringing of their children, or of Black males, then actually one sees a much more nuanced picture of the role of extended family, for example, of other male members of the Black community, but also the very positive support that Black peers give to each other in relation to education. And this is reflected in, when one asks about aspirations, educational aspirations, it's also reflected at that level as well. So there's an element then of, apportioning blame. It's not to say, I'm not arguing that issues to do with poverty, with anti-academic culture and so on, play no role. I'm not arguing that at all. They may well play a role, and they do play a role. And in fact, what the situation that we found when we visited schools and we talked to Black parents, Black children, Black teachers, it's when some of those when some of the kind of cultural attitudes that have been built up intergenerationally of resistance, of suspicion, of institutions, when those meet with the racialized attitudes of teachers, then it becomes a vicious cycle that perpetuates the issues of underachievement and of discrimination in education. So what these kinds of narratives do by solely focusing though on the home background of the learner is that they blame the victim, that's the first thing, but also they let schools and institutions off the hook for actually dealing with issues of racism in school, including low teacher expectations and so on. So from this erasure of racism, you then get the generation of inadequate solutions. So because the report has essentially proved what it set out to prove, it has essentially proved the prior assumptions of its authors, that institutionalized racism doesn't exist. None of the remedies, the supposed recommendations, actually address the possibility that schools and other institutions may be systemically racist. What you get is a rehash of school improvement and other kinds of school effectiveness research that's been around for many, many years and is itself quite problematic and contested, but also very bland, just a one-size-fits-all approach that if you focus on particular aspects of the school and of the school environment, then you'll raise the achievement of all learners. And of course, what this ignores is the need to actually differentiate, to be more subtle in your approach. What the evidence over many years has shown is that actually, you know, when schools adopt, for example, a whole school approach to tackling racism in education, through, for example, encouraging leaders to understand and to engage with racism in schools, this makes a real difference. When schools diversify their curriculum to make people of different faith backgrounds and different ethnicities feel that their experiences, their backgrounds are reflected in the curriculum, this makes a difference. When that's coupled with processes of ongoing staff development, this makes a difference. When schools are able to reach out and engage with communities that over the generations have been historically cut off from or have historically been sidelined or marginalized or made to in an antagonistic relationship with schools, then that can make a difference too. So there are a raft of measures. Another important one is using attainment data to really drill down at a subject level, departmental level, into which groups are doing well and which groups are doing less well. Now, these kinds of approaches go way beyond the kind of very bland school improvement, school effectiveness measures that the report proposes. And what has been shown historically is that when schools adopt these kinds of approaches, these whole school approaches, this doesn't just benefit Black and minority learners, it benefits all learners, because it's essentially about being able to drill down to the level of groups, subgroups, and ultimately individuals in a way that's able to more effectively target needs in the school. But those kinds of evidence are completely ignored in the Sewell Report. Okay, so that's the basis of my critique, and I'll be very happy to return to that during the discussion. I now want to move on and try to understand the report better, to try to understand how the report reflects changing ideologies, if you like, or changing racial formation in society. And in doing this, I'm drawing on Omi and Winant's work. And I think, many of you will be familiar with this. But of course, Omi and Winant see race, like class, like gender, like sexuality, as master categories of sociological analysis. That is to say that, they rather than see racism as a reflection of, or as an aspect, for example, of a class society, they see it as an important category that needs to be understood and analyzed in its own right. So they describe racial formation as the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. So they talk about, as sociologists based in the United States, their analysis is focused on the United States. They talk about the shift in racial formation from the days of slavery and the overt racism of the Jim Crow laws, of the immigration policies that existed and so on, through the Great Transformation. So they describe the era of the civil rights movement as a great transformation, to a shift towards, under Obama, what they describe as a colorblind approach. And then more recently, under Trump, a reassertion of more overt racism. So the useful thing about racial formation, though, is that it allows for a contextualized understanding of how racial formation operates across time, but also across different socio-cultural national boundaries. So in the UK, for example, under colonialism, racism was really justified, using scientific but also very overt culturally racist understandings of race as an essentialized category. In the immediate period following post-war period, with the influx of immigrants into the UK, you still saw, some very overt biological and culturally racist assumptions. And of course, they're still with us today. But what we've seen is a gradual shift. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But with the rise of multiculturalism and anti-racism, we've seen a reversion away from more overt racism towards the UK's own kind of so-called colourblind approach. So in the Sewell Report, there's this idea that we now live in a society where racism, where we've really, we've almost eradicated racism, that we are essentially a colourblind society where people can get on. But of course, we've also seen, as in the United States, a reassertion simultaneously and more recently of a very overt racism, whether it's in terms of immigration policy or other areas of social policy. So racial projects, Omi and Winant talk about racial projects, which they describe as the simultaneous and co-constitutive ways that racial meanings are translated into social structures and become racially signified. The useful thing is that it enables one to think about not just one racial project, but simultaneous racial projects. So in the context of education, and particularly the experiences of groups most at risk of underachieving, of Black and minority groups most at risk of underachieving, of Black Caribbean and of Pakistani heritage learners, one can see importantly there, one needs to link that or understand it in terms of specific forms of racism that intersect and interact with each other. Virulent anti-Black racism that's been evident in the UK throughout the years and is reasserting itself, but also of Islamophobia, different kinds of racism, different positionings of cultural and more biological aspects of discourse, different experiences of racism, but racism nonetheless. So that's significant, that's important. So also important is that racial projects can be defined as racist or anti-racist. So, a nationalist project, I argue, is racist because on balance, what it does is it diverts resources away from minority to historically disadvantaged groups towards the white majority. Multicultural and anti-racist projects, the other ones I will be describing, can more or less be described as anti-racist to the extent that they have challenged those racial structures. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction to the idea of racial formation. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this table. I hope you can. But in this table, I've tried to summarize from the paper my understanding of these three projects. The conservative nationalist project that, since in this post-Second World War period, which is the period I've really focused on in the paper, has been the dominant one. So, whether it's in terms of, going back to the early assimilationist policies, the busing of school children, the introduction of Section 11 funding, which was essentially to try and make sure that immigrant children learned English rather than also adopt a bilingual approach. You know, one can see those evidence of those approaches being very dominant early on, really. One can also see it at that time, you know, in the links that were made between race and intelligence, although, you know, those have subsequently been disavowed, but they've resurfaced more recently as well in more biological assertions of difference. So within this kind of discourse, there is really an essentialist view of race that continues to varying degrees rely on the long shadow, if you like, of biological racism. But racism within this discourse, rather than being, you know, a structural feature of society, is seen as isolated acts of prejudice on the part of individuals. And one sees that reflected very strongly in the Sewell Report. The overarching policy orientation, whether one looks at those early examples I just mentioned earlier, or more recent or historical examples, for example, the introduction of a very British-focused national curriculum under the Thatcher years and its continued prevalence today, support today by the Tory government as being essentially assimilationist in nature. The view of race relations is a meritocratic one. It reproduced in the Sewell Report that our institutions are fundamentally meritocratic and facilitate social mobility. An emphasis on Britain and British values in the curriculum, and we've seen that reasserted most recently particularly in relation to the history curriculum, and it's reproduced in the Sewell Report as well. And a focus in terms of, you know, attainment, as we've seen, on focusing on socioeconomic disparities. And again, this goes right back to some of the earliest policy in education. So if one reads the histories that Sally Tomlinson, Paul Warmington and others have produced on this, you know, this goes right back to 1971, for example, and the first kind of discussions about racial disparities in education. And then again, it was argued very vociferously there was a need to prioritize the white working class, really, as being the main victims of underachievement in education. The second main racial project, if you like, is that of multiculturalism. And of course, you know, Tariq and others have been central to these debates over many, many years, based on, you know, very different intellectual foundations of liberalism, of human rights, of pluralism, championed by different sections of society as well, more likely to be championed by urban liberal elites, and as well as civil society organizations and think tanks and many local authorities. I mean, it took hold from the 1970s. In fact, my father was involved in ILIA in the early efforts to introduce multiculturalism, and you know, the beginning of the Black History Month, for example, goes back to that era, the 1970s and 1980s, but also, you know, a focus on trying to close the attainment gap through various initiatives, an emphasis on providing language support to learners, and all of these have been attacked by conservative nationalists and have been systematically undermined. So whereas multiculturalism has had some kind of hold in the education system, we've seen it reflected, for example, in the more recently in the Ethnic Minority Achievement Grant, and those kinds of initiatives, the Raising Black Caribbean Achievement Projects and similar initiatives that have been targeted at trying to close the achievement gap. The support that's been provided under EMAG for language support for newly arrived learners and so on. And there have been some really key and very important landmark documents here, as we know. The Macpherson inquiry that first kind of acknowledged the existence of institutionalized racism, the Sewell Report, the Perec Report, which Tariq was involved in, and ironically, so was Tony Sewell. He was also a member of the Perec Commission then, even though at that time, the educational recommendations that came out of the Perec Report were very much in favor of the kinds of measures of policies I've just described. A third racial project is that of anti-racism. And of course, this continues to be met with real opposition by conservative nationalists. A concerted attack on Black Lives Matter, on efforts to decolonize the curriculum and so on. But it has very different origins. So it has origins in anti-colonial struggle. It really was linked historically to that, but also, in the anti-apartheid struggle, but also importantly to developments in the civil rights era in the United States, the work of Stokely Carmichael and others who identified at that time in the 1960s, this idea of institutionalized and systemic racism, and it took hold here as well, as a way of critiquing not just conservative nationalist approaches, but also multiculturalism. I mean, it was argued by anti-racists that multiculturalists, through ignoring the systemic structural nature of racism, were really playing into the hands of conservative nationalists. So there, the views, it really centers on this idea of white supremacy, and the target is really decolonizing, in the language of today, decolonizing the curriculum of tackling institutionalized racism. And this report, I don't know if any of you saw the program, the Steve McQueen series of programs, one of which was about education, and it actually took us back to the 70s, and you saw some of the grassroots, Black grassroots organizations that developed at the time, that were organized around, for example, the book, How the Education System Makes the Black Child Educationally Subnormal. Other struggles against school exclusions, against what has been perceived as systemic racism in education, have often been, grassroots in nature, but it hasn't really taken hold. I think the one instance where you could say that's an anti-racist approach is again in an anti-racist reading of the Macpherson report. The extent the Macpherson report actually acknowledged institutionalized racism can be seen as one of the few successes of that project. I myself, as I've mentioned, position myself between multiculturalism and anti-racism. Much of my own research has been around measures to try and tackle the attainment gap as it affects particularly Black learners, but also to challenge racism as it affects Islamic and other groups. I've also been committed in my own work to anti-racism. So currently I'm involved in efforts to try and decolonize the curriculum in the University of Bristol itself, for example, working with local schools in that area. And what I want to argue, in fact, this is the last slide, and then maybe we can open it up to discussion and conversation, is that, yes, the Sewell Report, in my perspective, is fundamentally flawed for the reasons I've mentioned. But despite its shortcomings, it does pose challenges for multiculturalists and anti-racists. I think one of those challenges is that, the term institutionalized racism can be very woolly. I think you know, what the Sewell Report has played on is that woolliness to some extent, that we need to do more to show or to really, you know, reassert and to revisit the evidence and do more research into how, you know, institutionalized racism actually works, to introduce the nuance into the debate, into the understanding of institutionalized racism. For example, the way that it affects different groups of Black and Asian learners in different ways, going back to that earlier discussion about different forms of racism, Islamophobia and anti-Black racism, for example. And we need to understand in a rapidly changing context how, for example, anti-Black racism takes on new forms and new dimensions. One needs to question, you know, one can use it, for example, and I'll be happy to discuss this a bit later on, but one of the things the Sewell Report does is it says that because many Black African learners seem to do better than Black Caribbean learners, that, you know, racism therefore doesn't play a role. But actually that's misunderstanding the nature of anti-Black racism. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in a moment. I'm just very conscious that I've been talking for a while. I think, you know, there is also a need for us to, for anti-racists, multiculturalists, to really, you know, project a positive view of Black identities and Black cultures that goes beyond the very narrow confines proposed by the Sewell Report in their idea of, you know, celebrating the making of modern Britain and the role of Black and Asian people in that. We need to simultaneously understand and do justice to a history of British colonialism, of imperialism, of slavery, of expropriation, and of genocide that was conducted under colonialism. And rather than brush these aside, use them as a basis for articulating a new kind of reparative justice that can form the basis for a planetary humanism. I think there's a real case for a rapprochement, actually, and this again reflects my own leanings towards between multiculturalism and anti-racism. This isn't in fact a new argument. It's something that I've been arguing for many years, that Tariq, Steve May and others argued way back in the early noughties, you know, that this kind of rapprochement needs to take place, both in the curriculum, as I've suggested, but also, you know, I think one of the weaknesses of anti-racist discourse over the years is that it's said, well, you know, structural racism is the issue. There's no point getting involved in measures to try and address the attainment gap when the whole system is racist. And I've always rejected that argument. You know, as someone from a Gramscian understanding of hegemony that I've described in terms of racial formation, you know, I think there's a very important role in terms of contesting racism in the education system. And I think one needs to work both within the system and also, you know, continue to support campaigns for racial and cultural justice in our communities, in our Islamic communities, our Muslim communities against Islamophobia, in our Black communities against the continued racist prevalence of anti-Black racism in the education system and in other areas of society. I'll stop there, Tariq, because I've been talking for a very long time, and it would be very interesting to hear people's views and to garner any questions or comments that people have.
Yes, thank you very much, Leon. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and we have plenty of time for discussion to do so. So thank you for that. And I'm very happy to bring people in now. You can put the functional Zoom hand up, or you can just make yourself visible and physically put your hand up, however you want to come in. And if you want to ask your question without operating your video, just the audio, that's fine as well. While we're waiting for someone to come in, oh, well, someone has come in. Okay. So Tarjinder Gill, you'd like to come in? Yeah, go ahead.
I need to unmute myself. So I do appreciate a lot of what you're saying, and I do think there's a lot of scope for what you're saying between multiculturalism and anti-racism. However, I think having taught in schools particularly in primary schools for over 15 years, what you're saying will not materialize. There's no point in saying that school improvement measures don't work when actually the very thing that is a barrier to those school improvement measures are the kind of radical politics, the kind of radical ideas of relevance, etc., towards Black children in particular. And having taught in Brixton, that's what I was seeing. So we weren't concentrating on the fundamentals at all. We were concentrating on the political aspects. So when they come across, you know, when they're failing, and then equally when working class children are failing, I'm seeing politics, I'm not seeing the actual teaching of children. So what do you say to that? Because I completely appreciate that you're coming from a different perspective, but from a classroom teacher's perspective, the things that we need to do, sometimes you're hindering, not you personally, but you know, these ideological perspectives are hindering because you're saying to us, we can't teach these things because they're racist. Or for example, maths is racist, it just comes out, you know, but that's the thing that I need to teach.
Yeah, go ahead, Leon.
Okay. Should I respond to that? Or
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a really interesting and useful point, because you know, I think you know, it is an issue that it's important to address. I'm certainly not saying that, you know, school improvement and school effectiveness research doesn't have any validity. I think it does. In fact, what I'm arguing is that when one looks at, for example, a whole school approach with its focus on leadership, on the curriculum, on the effective use of data, on staff professional development, on engagement with parents, these are all actually benchmarks of school improvement. These are parts of the seven, you know, what have been 7 gateways into school, aspects of school improvement. You know, they're the same things. But what a whole school approach that has anti-racism at its heart does is it provides more nuance to that. It asks us actually, rather than just look at an individual level, you know, one also needs to look at the level of different groups, whether those be boys and girls, or whether those be groups defined in terms of race or ethnicity, to understand relative performance of different groups across the curriculum. So what it does, in fact, is it works within a school improvement framework, but adds more nuance to it, because it allows you to drill down into these aspects. And it's these aspects of school improvements I think are really important. So I don't think that an anti-racist approach is contradictory to that. I think
it seems to be slightly, because what you're saying is that one of the things that you said was that we're diverting resources away from ethnic minorities towards like white pupils. But if you've done what I've done, which is like literally go from back to back, go and teach Black Caribbean students in Brixton to one of the most white working class areas that there is in like Leicester, you can see the commonalities, you can see the problems that are approaching these students. And it's not to do with race, it is to do with class. And I think sometimes the anti-racist approach, particularly with critical race theory, is so based on race, they just don't see there are class-based issues that are affecting both groups in the same way. So diverting resources away, and I know I stuck it in the chat, but I feel passionately about it. You know, what do I do about these kids? You know, what do I do in my own classroom? So I can't just ignore the fact these white working class boys are suffering the same issues that, you know, Black boys are suffering down in Brixton. And also, when we talk about whole class or whole school improvement in terms of behaviour, etc., it's easy to dismiss it But there are reasons why we do that. So the main reason being that we're trying to improve outcomes for the majority of pupils. So if you sit there fixated on that one pupil who might get excluded, that's fine. But when I was in Brixton, you know, I had a class of 30 children, and if I ignored the behaviour of one child, you know, for the sake of like anti-racist campaigners, all the rest of it, who am I really, whose education am I really rejecting here? It's the other 29 Black children in my class. So too often those kind of nuances, those kind of realities are ignored. So you talk about lived experience, but actually the lived experience of teachers in those circumstances seem to be ignored themselves if they don't fit the narrative that you want. And not you personally, you know, but just in terms of that sort of ideological framework. Moreover, if we're actually talking about actually improving outcomes for all groups, we have to really think that which groups need it and which groups don't. Because the structural racism thesis obviously involves all ethnic minorities having some sort of racism exhibited towards them in the same way at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't disparities and there aren't differences in terms of the way that teachers think, but I think that the solutions presented always seem to be the same as well. So you're saying that the solutions towards us are the same. Well, I'm saying the solutions you present towards us are always the same as well, and they keep failing. So how do we break this cycle?
Okay.
Before you respond to that, Leon, I see that Nicola Anderson wants to come in, and judging by some of the things she's presented in the chat, I think she has something to say that connects with this conversation. Am I right, Nicola? So
yes,
why don't we have you next, and then let Leon respond to both of you?
Yes, I mean, you make very good points, but as a white working class person who was failed by the education system, my dyslexia was never picked up. The difference between a white working class boy and a Black Caribbean heritage boy, as in terms of being failed by the system, is the white boy will always have white privilege. He will always have a sense of belonging, whereas the Black Caribbean child won't. So yes, we can all talk about equality for all, but it's actually equity that these children need, understanding that, yeah, white working class boys are being failed, but they will still get on in society better because of the white privilege. You know, I am helping a parent at the moment whose child is mixed race. He is from Pakistani heritage and Nigerian heritage. They are a very well-to-do middle-class family. And this child will never be seen as middle class because of the colour of his skin. Yet he's having a very nice upbringing. He's losing his confidence because 2 weeks ago, a staff member called him a monkey. Now, this is not the 1970s. And that kind of language is still happening to children in our schools today, and they are being massively failed just because they've got more melanin in the skin. Something needs to change.
Sorry, I just want to jump in there. Where is that school? Where is the complaint? Because as far as I'm concerned, every school that I've ever worked in, there's anything that relates to teachers, relates to other children, we have literally logged it down. So when you talk about lived experiences, I do respect that, because I do respect the fact that other people have been in different circumstances, but we need to have an overall picture, because if we keep going based on anecdote, we're never going to get anywhere. So
we must let other people come
sure.
in. And I think, Leon, if you'd like to respond to the last set of comments, and then if someone else wants to come in, we'll bring them in as well.
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Tarek, and thanks to the two contributors there. I think you know, I do argue in the paper the central importance as part of the work, the important work going forward, to understand how race and class intersect with each other in terms of attainment. That, you know, yes, I agree with Nicola's point fully. You know, the education system fails our white working class children. It's a travesty. And our education system has always been class-based. It's always been one that has reproduced class inequalities in society. It continues to be, within the OECD countries, one of the most unequal in terms of class. So it's not to argue that class is not an important, salient and central issue that needs to be addressed in the system. But it's really to support Nicola's point there, that if you're Black and working class, then you suffer a double penalty, because you also get discriminated against on the basis of your race. And this is the issue that we're trying to get here. Understanding those intersections and how they interact with each other is crucial. It's really important. We need to better understand that. But what the Sewell Report does is it removes race from the equation altogether, as if that's not an issue. And that is the objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Leon. Perhaps I could ask a theoretical question, that is to say, a question in relation to the sort of the theoretical or ideological frameworks that you were presenting. And my question is specifically to do with the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain, or the PAREC report, Biku Parek having chaired that commission. Though before I get to it, I might just mention one small factual error in what you said, Leon. Tony Sewell was never a member of that commission, so you must be confusing him with someone else. But the main thing that I wanted to ask was the way that you slice up multiculturalism and anti-racism. So you obviously said very clearly that you see yourself as in some way straddling both or combining both or being drawn to both, and that one of the forward-looking projects from where we are onwards should be a greater focus on working to create a rapprochement between these perspectives, which otherwise can be discrete and sometimes antagonistic. So I totally agree with that aim, but I wonder if you're not missing something, or if you're not, I'd be interested in what is the basis for the kind of slicing that you do. Because you said that the Macpherson report is a report that both multiculturalists and anti-racists can find something in. And it's perhaps, you know, one of the rare reports, from your point of view, one of the rare reports that chimes or utilizes an anti-racist perspective. But I'd like to say that the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain report, the PAREC report, is one that actually is a rapprochement between multiculturalism and anti-racism. You earlier on in your talk referred to Stuart Hall. I mean, you were referring to his work on, you know, analyzing Thatcherism, but obviously, as we all know, he's made an enormous contribution to our thinking about racism and anti-racism. And he was a member, unlike Tony Sewell, he was a member and a very active member of the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain report. And it's got a lot on institutional racism, both as an idea, but also in specific policy areas, including education, but also others, you know, crime and the criminal justice system, housing, and so on. But perhaps the feature that doesn't attract you quite so much, and why you therefore don't think of it as a rapprochement, and think that the Macpherson report is a more of a straddling between multiculturalism and anti-racism report, is what I would agree is that the PAREC report takes anti-racism within a multiculturalism framing. And you are more attracted to an anti-racism framing. I think that is probably the critical difference, that you would like to have a multiculturalism with an anti-racism framing. And we, as far as I know, but happy to hear suggestions from you and from anyone else, we don't have a very good example, not just in terms of reports, but perhaps also in terms of scholarly and theoretical writing, of an anti-racist approach, which includes multiculturalism. But I would like to say that in the Parek report, and perhaps also in my work, we do have examples of multiculturalist perspectives which include anti-racism, but include anti-racism within the terms of multiculturalism.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, actually, Tariq. Thank you for that. Yeah, so, okay. So first of all, thanks for the factual correction, and I'll go back and I'll review that. And I'm not sure where I remember where that information came from, and maybe we can talk about that off the record, but after this event. But thank you for that. But in terms of the theoretical framing, I think the useful thing about racial formation theory is that it allows for these broad racial projects, if you like, to be understood in quite a nuanced and flexible way, rather than being hermetically sealed off from each other. They have interacted. And in fact, one of the arguments of the paper is that, what different reports do, what different political parties do, what different individuals do, including myself, is position these projects in relation to each other in different ways. So, the idea of hegemony of racial formation is of a totality in which these different elements can be positioned in relation to each other in shifting ways. So, I'd be very happy to talk to you about the way that, for example, the emphasis that's given to a multicultural framing as compared to an anti-racist framing in the Parek report, the relative importance that's given, for example, to the fundamental basis of those different discourses. I mean, the multiculturalism comes from a different intellectual tradition. It's founded in a different philosophical, intellectual, sociological tradition than anti-racism. But I'd be interested to talk about. But it's not, in fact, it doesn't, in fact, contradict what my understanding to appreciate that aspect of the Parek report. That it could, in fact, position those discourses in within the same report, albeit giving different emphasis to each. So, I think that's the case for inquiry. It's an interesting conversation to be had about how those. But I think the value of racial formation is it allows for that kind of nuanced approach, I would argue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We now have a number of people who've put their hand up and want to come in. Why don't we take two of them and then allow you, Leon, to respond to them? So the first one is Marlowe's, if I pronounce your name correctly, Marlowe's, and then Merid, your second. So go ahead, Marlowe's.
Yes, thank you so much for this really relevant lecture. I was wondering about how this translates to school diversity policies. So, for example, in the Flemish context, there's an understanding that there are, for example, school diversity policies that could be assimilationist, multicultural, or colorblind. And there's also no mention of this, for example, an anti-racist school diversity policy in certain articles. And I was just wondering if this similar theoretical discussion could also be important and insightful for more local school diversity policies. Thank you so much.
And you, Gary. You're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Leon. Thanks very much. I think you presented with a very difficult set of arguments, and with different groups of people here. I mean, I empathise particularly with teachers and students in schools, although, and I understand that plight, the difficulties of all that, and maybe that's why I'm now in a university, I'm not sure, because of the difficulties of working there. But I also have a sense that we might be looking the wrong way. I mean, can we not look back at the overarching demands that education appeals to, you know, a modernist agenda, and, you know, that modernity itself asks schools to produce hierarchies and differences. I mean, that's what it's asking them to do. And so instead of looking down into schools, if you like, we might look the other way and look at what the bigger social imaginary is, so that we can be active in that direction. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Over to you, Leon.
Okay, well, thanks both of you for those contributions and questions. And so to try to answer both at once, if you like, I think, you know, the idea of racial formation, I think, tries to link, you know, how this idea of racial projects and how they play out with a broader understanding of the social whole. So racial formation needs to be understood in relation to constructs like Western modernity. And I think, you know, one of the things about the decolonizing debate is that it tries to do that. It tries to frame, you know, issues of decolonizing the curriculum within a critique of Western modernity and how that reproduces hierarchies, as you say, right? It's coming at it, as you say, from a slightly different perspective, but I don't necessarily see them as being contradictory. But then also, if I may just extend that as well to respond to the other contribution, I think the other you know, facet of racial formation theory is that it really allows you to do quite interesting comparative analysis. So, you know, in the Flemish context, the racial formation in that context is different, as it is different between the UK and the US, for example, in a way I hope I've indicated. You know, it will be different there too. So the kinds of racial projects that one might encounter in education might be very different, you know, based on that history. I don't know enough about the Flemish context to be able to say anything further, really, other than, you know, I think that racial formation theory allows for a comparative analysis, understanding how racial projects take on different forms in different contexts, albeit, going back to Mairead's point, perhaps within an overarching Western framework of Western modernity. But I think more intellectual work's needs to be done to relate those two ideas.
Thank you, Leon. So we'll take another two questions together. So I can see Nimi, you've got your hand up, and then Sharon. So Nimi first, please.
Thank you. I kind of maybe wanted to pick up on Mairead's point because it was a really lovely point. Maybe one way of coming at it is to say that I really appreciated the policy typologies that you made in terms of their political content. And it struck me that perhaps they could also be classified in terms of the different anxieties that they were animated by. So in the Sewell Report, we can see that, you know, what it's seeking to do is to create or to stoke kind of specific anxieties by setting the white working class against the Black and the brown working class, right? You can see they're playing on those anxieties. And so I guess there are two things that come out of that when I see that. The first is that, well, what is the counter project against this that seeks to create solidarities, to forge solidarities in the face of that project? And then I think the second part is to ask, well, what are the kind of transnational dimensions to that? Because some of the contours of the policy that you're describing are shaped by transnational dimensions, such as PREVENT, such as the hostile environment policy, which have a lot to do with kind of British imperial foreign policy and its racist imperial dimensions, right? But at the same time, an adequate response to that then cannot be purely domestic, right? So if the part of the problem of the Sewell Report is kind of transnational, then part of the response to that cannot be purely domestic. So yeah, I just kind of, and maybe that's a different way of playing with Mairead's question, but I kind of wanted to pick it up again.
Thank you. Sharon, would you like to put your question?
Yeah, sorry, I just thought I'd try and turn my camera on. I just want to, I think one of the things that I find really helpful about the report, about the paper, is how it looks at the Sewell Report and it contextualizes it within a longer history. And so, because often we could talk about the Sewell Report, but we don't actually think about how it connects with previous discourses or other ways in which race is being conceptualized or acted on in the UK society. And for me, when we then get to the end of the paper, and I think this goes back to Mairead's point, is we seem to go from that broad discussion, that kind of historical contextualization, down to almost a kind of practical implementation. I don't quite know how to say that. What I think what I would like to ask Leon is, how can we use what the analysis that you've done to think about the historical, to think about how that relates to the contemporary, in order for us to think about what might be or what might become in the future based on what we already know? I don't know if that question makes sense. Because I also think, coming back to some of the conversation with Tajinder, and I think that it's not a case, I think firstly, when we think about this discussion, it's not a case, we can think about the kind of minutiae of the school. Obviously that's important because we're talking about education and schooling. But I'm wondering if there's an element of stepping back a little bit and reflecting on some of those wider questions, and then hence how that then impacts on what happens in schools. Because I don't think it's a case of treating children differently because of their inverted commas race, but understanding the social structure that we're operating in. Because it's almost as if I'm pretending I'm not living in this common era. I am. And I have to understand the reality that my children are living in. This is the world that they live in. And if I don't respond to that, if I pretend they're all the same, and if I act in the same way, that means I'm not understanding something about the world I'm living in. But anyway, that's for you to talk to us about, Leon.
Thank you. Over to you, Leon.
Okay, well, thanks for those really useful and challenging questions. I think, you know, I'm actually learning an awful lot through this discussion. Thank you for some of these comments. I think you're right. You know, I think I did in the end focus largely on, you know, what we can do today and tomorrow as practitioners to try and as people who are interested in making a difference in the here and now, you know. But I think also to some extent I began to try to address some of these bigger questions. So for example, I think another disappointing thing about the Sewell, or another aspect of the Sewell Report, is that it criticizes anti-racist or multicultural approaches and things like decolonizing the curriculum for being essentially negative. It actually explicitly says that in the report. And so I tried to, in the end conclusion, I also tried to bring in some decolonial thought, actually, by Mbembe and others who have argued for a new planetary humanism. And I'm not sure, Sharon, if this relates to your point, or indeed you, Nimi, or indeed you, Mairead, that, you know, there is a bigger question out here about, you know, how we understand the human condition and the continuing effects of the colonial matrix of power, as Mignolo and others have described it. The overarching hegemony of Western modernist thought, whether it's in our own indigenous education policy, or whether it's in global education policy, in the way that we conduct our aid relationships, for example, the extent to which Western modernist ideas of what education means, fundamentally, the structure of education, the nature of schooling itself as a disciplinary institution, the linear nature of time, the Eurocentric basis of the curriculum, not just here, but across the world. All of these things are connected, of course, through what Mignolo describes as the colonial matrix of power. So in the paper, I'm kind of focusing on, yes, I do focus on the here and now, on what we need to do, because in contesting this reality, if you like, we can do what we can do. We need to do what we have to do. We need to take action in ways that we are meaningful and local action as well. You know, we can't change the whole trajectory of 500 years of colonialism overnight, but what we can hope to do in the here and now is to address some of these issues through education policy here in the UK. So, you know, some of the ideas that Sharon and other colleagues in the school have been working with in the Race, Empire and Education Collective is this idea of reparative justice, how, you know, through the curriculum we can educate our young people about our past, not in a way that says everything to do with our past is bad and horrible, but to critically engage with the past as a way of sensitizing people to the nature of racial and cultural injustice as it's emerged in the broader context of colonialism, so that they then have the tools to critically engage with that history. So, you know, yes, there's plenty more that can be written and said about all of this.
Thank you. We still have a few more minutes if someone would like to ask a question, perhaps a new line of inquiry. Well, I will if no one else will. So I wanted to ask you a methodological question, Leon, that goes back to the early part of your presentation and part of your critique of the report, of its treatment of quantitative work and qualitative work. So I think we'd all agree, and certainly I think you do, that one needs to have a kind of critical perspective on quantitative work rather than a kind of positivist one, that one has to see how quantitative analysis obscures as well as illuminates certain things, and that at best it can only be part of the story, not the whole story. And presumably, I think you'd say the same thing about qualitative work, that at best it can only be part of the story and not the whole story. So if so, my question is, we have some idea about how to be critical about quantitative work, you know, by, for instance, questioning its assumptions and omissions. And you did some of that yourself. But how can we be critical, equally critical, rigorous about qualitative work and not, as it were, take it as face value in the way that we shouldn't take quantitative work at face value? So how can we be critical of qualitative data as well as analysis, you know, in a comparable way to what you would recommend we would do with quantitative work?
Well, I thank you for that, Terry. And, you know, these are crucial questions for us involved in research in this kind of area. So, you know, my own position, if you like, is influenced by Bhaskara's critical realism. I see, you know, the fallibility of all knowledge, all epistemologies. I see the potential benefits, but also the potential fallibilities of all knowledge ways of all epistemologies and trying to apprehend complex reality. So, you know, one has to be as critical with qualitative work as with quantitative work. Both have a place in research in this area, and I think that's also, you know, as I've suggested, one of the failings of the Sewell Report, that it doesn't use a mixed methods approach. I would actually advocate a mixed methods approach when looking at things like racial disparities, because I think there are positive things to be learned. I think quantitative work can give you a surface actuality of what's going on in terms of trends over time and so on. But to really understand the processes of what's going on, one also needs to get behind the numbers and to look at qualitative work, but to treat that critically, to understand that, you know, once one gets into the world of how people interpret their reality, then one needs to treat that critically and to, you know, compare and contrast it with other people's perspectives, to look at how that fits. I think in the end, what one does as a practitioner, as well as a researcher, is to bring together different kinds of evidence and to make some sort of rational judgment based on a consideration of the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. But from a critical realist perspective, what's important is to develop understanding of the underlying causality, drawing on these different kinds of evidence, but treating them critically. That's a very limited, sorry, that's you know, I hope that's not too, obviously there's a lot more that could be said about all of that, but I hope that's given you an indication that whilst I value both quantitative and qualitative work, I also see them as fallible and needs to be treated critically.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's, you know, brought us to the end of what I think has been a very full and interesting discussion, following a interesting and quite comprehensive presentation about some of the issues raised by the Sewell Report, and therefore some of the issues about education today in Britain, and racism, anti-racism, multiculturalism, and so on. So thank you very much, Leon, for presenting and facilitating that discussion. And thank you everybody else for coming and for participating in the way that you did. If you're on the Ethnicity Centre email list, then you will get details of our next seminar or seminars. If you're not on that email list but would like to be, if you Google the Ethnicity Centre, you'll find us, and there'll be a contact email address there. So thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.